Salve amicus res publica. Okay, that was Latin. But what I did say in Latin was greetings, friends of the Republic. And Latin is the native tongue of the ancient Romans. And Rome is the next stop on our journey through classical history. You know, we've put the Greeks behind us now. They were awesome, but we've put them behind us. And the Greeks, if they are the cradle of Western civilization, then the Romans are the true foundation upon which all of Western society is built. And we'll begin our study of Rome today with the rise of the Roman Republic. So what are we looking at here? What are the essential questions for today's session? Well, we'll look at the origins of the city of Rome. Where does Rome come from? There is a mythological beginning to the city of Rome, but we're going to focus on their historical beginning based on what we know. And in the process, we're going to meet another mysterious group of people called the Etruscans. And we'll see how these people were the ones who built Rome into the city it became, who built Rome into one of the wealthiest cities in all of Italy. Then we'll move on and we'll see how Rome became a republic. From there, we're going to break down how the government of the Roman Republic worked. We'll look at the basic aspects and the basic functionality of the government of the Roman Republic. Now, let's make no mistake here. The government of Rome has a huge influence on the United States. And so for that reason, we're going to look at the government of the Roman Republic, but we're also going to compare it to the U.S. government. We're going to see the ways in which the Roman Republic influences us here today. We'll see the ways they're similar. We'll also see some of the differences as well. And with that being said, without further ado, let's begin. So the origins of the Roman Republic, in a lot of ways the origins of Rome are shrouded in mystery, because we don't have a ton of information about this time period in history. But what we do know is that sometime between about 800 and 700 BC, a group of people called the Latins inhabited several small villages on 7 hills that surrounded a swampy plain called Latium in central Italy. Now, over time, these villages would join together to become one community that would be called Rome. And the name Rome supposedly comes from the city's first king, a man named Romulus. It's hard to know whether or not he really existed, but that's where the Romans say that the name came from. What we do know for sure is that they didn't stay independent for long, because by 620 BC, a group of people from the northern part of Italy, called the Etruscans, moved south and took over Rome. Now, we equally don't know much about the Etruscans. They left a written language, but we can't really decipher it. What we do know about the Etruscans comes from their art and architecture, material culture that they left behind. That's an example of some Etruscan art there in the top right-hand corner. What we can tell from what they left behind is that they're clearly very wealthy, very artistic and cultured people, and their culture is very similar to that of the Greeks. Perhaps a lot of Greek influence, maybe some contact there. The Etruscans are going to build Rome into a great city. The Etruscans find Rome as a bunch of farming villages, homes made out of wood, buildings made out of thatch, and they teach the Romans how to build with stone and tile. So Rome becomes a city of stone, buildings with stone and tile roofs. They build city streets, paved city streets throughout the city of Rome. The Etruscans drained the swamps that existed in the middle of the 7 hills, drained out the swamps, and in their place, they built a city center called the Forum. The Forum would become the center of Roman life and the seat of Roman government. The Forum is basically like the Agora in Greece, a downtown area where the temples are, the marketplace is, where government interacts. So the Forum is just the Roman version of the Agora. And speaking of temples, the Etruscans built temples for the Romans and taught them their religious rituals, which, incidentally, were an awful lot like the Greeks. We're pretty sure the Etruscans had some Greek influence here. So the Romans are learning the Greek-styled religion from the Etruscans. And Roman religion really turns out to be just Greek religion with the gods having different names. The gods look the same, control the same aspects of nature, the mythology is similar, they just give them different names. So again, we see the influence of Greece even in Rome. And so it is that the Etruscans built Rome into one of the wealthiest and most powerful cities in all of Italy. But despite this, what the Roman histories tell us is that the Etruscan kings were rather harsh rulers. The Etruscan kings came from an Etruscan family of nobility called the Tarquins. And by 509 BC, the Romans, tired of Tarquin rule, had risen up in revolt and driven the last king out of the city. With the removal of the Etruscans, the Romans declared their city to be a new type of government called a republic. In Latin, they called it res publica, meaning the public thing. because as opposed to being a privately held thing that was ruled just by a king, the government and the city itself was now something of the public, of the people. Now, let's not confuse a republic with a democracy. In Greece, a democracy was a government in which every single citizen directly controlled the government. However, a republic, which we learned earlier, is a form of government in which the citizens elect leaders to run the government for them. So the citizens don't directly control the government, instead they elect people to run the government for them. This is the same type of government that we have in the US today. Now, in Roman society, you really had two main social groups. On the one hand, you had the patricians. Patrician comes from the Latin term patri, which means father. This is your upper crust of society. These are the nobles. This is the aristocracy, the wealthy upper class. These people obtain their position in society through birth. You cannot work your way up the ladder to become a patrician. You have to be born into a patrician family to be of the nobility. Then on the other hand, you have pretty much everyone else, what the Romans called the plebeians, or plebs for short. The plebs literally were everybody else. If you weren't a patrician, you were a pleb. Wealthy landowners, non-aristocratic townspeople, small landowners, merchants, artisans, shopkeepers, small farmers, laborers. If you're not a patrician, you're a pleb. You're everybody else. And in Rome, both patrician and pleb had the right to vote. They had freedom of speech. They shared common responsibilities like paying taxes and serving in the military when called upon. However, only patricians were allowed to hold public office. So it's a republic, and you can vote for who you want in office, but you can only vote for patricians because they're the only ones that are allowed to sit in government. Now, likewise, in the United States, all U.S. citizens have the right to vote, have freedom of speech. All American citizens have to pay taxes, just like they did in Rome. However, all U.S. citizens don't have to serve in the military. In Rome, all citizens served in the military when called upon. In the U.S., we have a volunteer professional military. So you don't have to serve, you volunteer. And as far as holding office is concerned, any American citizen, no matter his wealth, social class, has the right to hold public office so long as you meet the eligibility standards. Now, Rome's government is divided into two separate branches: a legislative branch and an executive branch. Compare that to the United States, where we too are divided into separate branches. Heck, that's where the idea came from. Dividing your government into separate branches came from the Romans. We have a legislative and an executive branch, but we also have a third branch, the judicial branch. So both the U.S. and Rome divide their government into separate branches, but we have three as opposed to two. Now, in Rome, the legislative branch was made up of two houses, thus making the Roman legislature a bicameral legislature, meaning it has two chambers. You have the Roman Senate, and you have the Assembly of Centuries. Now, the Roman Senate is the primary lawmaking body in Rome. The Roman Senate consisted of 300 patrician men who were duly elected by the Roman citizens. And once elected, these senators served for life. And the job of the Roman Senate is to propose and pass legislation, to advise the consuls, we'll meet those guys soon, debate foreign policy in the defense of Rome, approve building contracts for roads and temples and so on and so forth. A lot of mundane things, but it's what any legislature does. And the Assembly of Centuries, for their part, didn't really do too much. That's just 100 patrician men, and all they do is they elect the officials of the executive branch. So really the primary body here is the Senate. Now, in the U.S., our Congress, made up of our House of Representatives and Senate, is our legislative branch. We, too, are a bicameral legislature because our legislature has two houses. Now, unlike Rome, our Senate has 100 members. They had 300, we have 100. We get that number because we have 50 states, and each state gets 2 senators. So, 100 senators in the Senate. Furthermore, our senators are elected to serve 6-year terms. That means every 6 years, they go up again for re-election, unlike the Romans, whose senators served life terms. Once you were in until you retired or died. You know, whichever came first. And our Senate, along with our House of Representatives, helps to develop and pass legislation just like the Roman Senate did. Rome's executive branch of government has some similarities to ours as well. There's a clear influence. The executive branch of any government has the job of enforcing the laws passed by the legislature. And in Rome, their executive branch consisted of 2 patrician officials called consuls. So these two patrician men were elected by the Assembly of Centuries, and their job was generally just to run the day-to-day affairs of the city. Consuls served a 1-year term, and they had several powers that are very similar to some of the powers and authorities that our executives have. The consuls in Rome were commander-in-chief of the Roman military, so not only were they political leaders, but they also had to be generals. And the consuls also had a special power called the veto power. In Latin, veto means I reject or I strike down, and the consuls could use the veto power to veto any act of the Senate, or they could veto any act of the other consul. Now, in the U.S., our executive branch, tasked with enforcing the laws of our country, is run by one chief executive, which is our president. And unlike in Rome, where the Assembly of Centuries chooses their chief executives, the citizens of the United States vote and elect our chief executive. Once elected, a president serves a 4-year term. You compare that to the 1-year term of the Roman consuls, our presidents serve 4-year terms. And as head of the executive branch, the president's job is to enforce the laws that are passed by Congress. And like in Rome, the U.S. president is commander-in-chief of the military. And like in Rome, the president has the power to veto. The president of the United States can veto any piece of legislation to prevent it from becoming law. Before a bill can become a law in the United States, it has to be signed by the president. And if the president vetoes that, then it will not become a law. Now, in Rome, there's some differences here. In the event of an extreme military crisis, the Roman Senate could appoint a temporary dictator to rule Rome with absolute control. But it was only supposed to be temporary and only during a time of crisis. And when the crisis was over, the dictator was, in theory, supposed to step down from power and return power to the Senate and the consuls. But unlike in Rome, the United States does not have any provision that allows for a dictatorship. As a matter of fact, our Constitution is designed specifically to prevent that sort of thing from happening. Now, the U.S. has a third branch of government that the Romans don't have, and that's the judicial branch. The judicial branch in the United States contains our Supreme Court and all of the lower courts beneath it. And the job of the judicial branch is to judge when the laws have been broken and to determine the constitutionality of laws. That is to say, to make sure that laws passed by the legislature are in line with the rules set forth in our Constitution. In Rome, they didn't have a judicial branch, but they did have a system of courts that was overseen by patrician judges. Patrician judges, that's key. You see, the patrician judges had this nasty habit of constantly finding in favor of their patrician buddies. So in order to ensure that the law was interpreted fairly by these judges, the laws of Rome were written down on bronze tablets, big, huge bronze tablets, and they were placed in the forum where everybody could see them. And these written laws were called the 12 Tables. The 12 Tables are the written laws of Rome. Now, written down laws, that's nothing new. That's been going on since the era of Hammurabi in Sumeria. But the 12 Tables did create an important legal principle that still guides a lot of our legal system today. Among other things, the 12 Tables established the legal principle of innocent until proven guilty. This means that in court, we do not assume that you are guilty and you must prove your innocence. Instead, you are assumed innocent and you must be proven guilty. And this continues to be one of the guiding principles of our justice system in the United States today. So there you have it, folks. We looked at the origins of the Roman Republic. We looked at the historical origins of the city of Rome. We met the Etruscans to find out how they built Rome into one of the wealthiest cities in all of Italy. We also saw Rome become a republic, and then we examined each of the specific bits of how the government of the Roman Republic worked and compared it to the United States of America. So be prepared to discuss each of these topics the next time that we meet. And as always, until that time, I bid you farewell.